Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Space for Life. I have with me Joe Wise, my creative producer and handle everything producer. So Joe, great to have you with today's episode again. And today's episode is going to be really fun. It kind of gets at the core of something that matters a lot to me, that is kind of at the forefront of what I think about, feels like all day, every day. And that's, how do I grow as a person? You know, how do I actually move from place A to a better place B in my life? And so what are the practices and mechanisms for that? And that's kind of the way I think about all of life. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the Links for Life podcast. It's the way I think about golf. It's the way I think about all areas of my life. So I think this is going to be hopefully a really useful episode, not so much of things that I can tell someone else to do, but the things that I've learned and tried to put into practice and worked on in my own life. And so I think I probably should mention for those that are on our YouTube channel that I have a third guest in today's podcast, and that's our new puppy, Coco, who I am dog sitting for during this episode. And so if you happen to hear a few little yips and barks along the way, Coco just wants to let you know she's here.
Yeah. Coco and I are honored to be co-host on this episode. It's going to be a fun one.
Well, she has a lot to add to this. So, you know.
She does.
Yeah. So people who know us know we really love Coco. So she's joining us for today's episode.
She tried to make an appearance at, I think it was the episode with David about his book. She tried to make an appearance down at the end, and unfortunately I edited her out, so I won't do it this time, Coco.
Well, that's right. Coco is kind of at the dog toddler stage, which means she's learned to break through every barrier that we have for keeping her out of spaces. So, you know, if can't beat them, join them. So Coco's joining us today.
I love it. It's fun.
Great.
But this episode I am really excited about, though, and in all seriousness, of just this concept of how we grow. And I think what's really cool about this approach that you've been talking about for the episode is it's not centered around growth tips, which is, for whatever reason, the industry of telling you what you need to do to grow is a massive industry, and there's tons of information out there. But this is focused so much around the environment that fosters growth. And for whatever reason, I feel like that often gets overlooked when we talk about growth.
Yeah, it really does. And that environment has a lot of things. There is a physical environment that's a part of it, but there are also processes and habits. And we come to realize, and some people do a great job, I think, of emphasizing this, that we are so much a product of our habits. And I would say, also, we're a product of our frameworks. And so what we're going to be talking about today is a combination of a framework for how we live our days and the habits that are within that framework that make these things work. So I'm hopeful it's going to be really helpful to some people who are hungry like I am, that I know you are, Joe, to figure out, how do we do this life well? You know, not just productive, but live lives of meaning and joy and relationships. And all of this stuff kind of converges around this, you know, creating an environment, framework, habits for growth. So I hope it's going to be very helpful.
And I'm sure it is, because it's not your idea or my idea. Like, if we look at it, so much of this stems from the parable of the sower, which I know that you talk on a lot. And so yeah, we're using the Bible as the cornerstone for this.
Yeah. I mean, I have to, you know, admit, if you know me well, I don't feel like I have anything original to say. That, you know, the useful things that I have to say are things that most often I first and foremost learn straight from Scripture. And that's such an important part of my life, or from others for whom it's an important part of their lives. I feel like it's kind of the source of wisdom. But that parable of the sower is just one that is very, very powerful to me. And it's a surprising parable in a sense, because we normally think of the things in life as black or white, kind of, one or the other, kind of having two sides. And the parable of the sower is this parable that Jesus taught that has four sides to it. It has four different things that tend to happen. And I think they are such parallels to life. And so Jesus describes this seed that is planted. And I'll try to go through this, pretty quickly. This seed that is planted in four types of soils. And these soils, as we're talking about it, are kind of the parallels of what we're talking about as environments, which have the framework and habits part of it. But he describes four different types of environments, soils, and only one of them really works well. So the first soil he talks about is seed that fell along a path, or what we would think about as hard pan soil. And that seed, because it's in the wrong environment, it's in a very unproductive environment, happens to just wash away. It produces no fruit whatsoever. And when we think about that, and we think about hard pan, because it's part of kind of what I've come to be so convinced of, hard pan is soil that is so tightly packed together, it's so dense that there's no room for the seed, and there's no room for water. Water just runs off of it. And I think it's such an analogy to our absolutely breakneck speed, cram full of life that is part of culture that people thinks is the source of fruitfulness, but it's not. So that's like seed number one. Seed number two is a soil that's shallow. So on the surface, at first, it can produce some fruit, but the shallowness means that the sun beats down on it and burns it out really quickly. And isn't that fascinating? I mean, that phrase just hits so much of our culture, of people who are burned out, and partly to blame with that is the shallowness of our lives. So it's so genius, and yet Jesus taught this parable 2,000 years ago. And so the third one even gets more at home. It's this soil that is mixed up. It's got thorns and stones all in it. And so the seed can't grow because it gets torn up or basically messed up by all of the things that clutter and distract from its growth. And so you think about it, and Jesus even speaks specifically about the worries of this world and the pleasures of this life that distract us from fruitfulness. And so that's the third seed. And then the fourth seed is this topsoil, what we think of this rich topsoil. And what do you have when you have topsoil? You have soil with a lot of space in it and a lot of purity to it. And that's what we're trying to create. And what Jesus is saying in this parable is that the fruitfulness of our lives is dependent on the soil. And so we create the soil of our lives, and our fruitfulness will be a natural byproduct of the soil that is us. And so then the question is, how can we be more like that fourth topsoil within our lives?
One of the things I love about this is, for so much of my life, I had thought and have heard talked or heard this parable taught where this is solely referring to the way that the gospel is received, and do you have a hard heart, or is your heart ready to receive the gospel?
Yeah.
Not diminishing any of that, but I just think, like you're mentioning, there's just such richness in this parable to dissect. I think that we can tend to minimize their parables, and there's just such a brilliance in the way that Jesus was and the way that he taught, and there's just such richness to unpack. And so that's what I love about the way you're approaching this.
Well, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think it gets at something fundamental, and that's our tendency to put life in silos and to think, okay, well, this is just a spiritual lesson. And
Right.
yet Jesus consistently talked about all of our being, and the verb which David Dwight and I talked about in the episode on his book, the verb in Greek that talks about people being saved, that word actually means healed also. And God wants all of us. You think about the great commandment, love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And it's like everything that Jesus is talking about is saying, no, it's all of life. It's not just a spiritual thing. It's your physical, it's your emotional, it's your relational thing. He wants to heal all of that. And so I actually think that this isn't my just applying this parable in a different way than Jesus would have wanted. I think God wants to bear fruit in all of the areas of our life. And so this soil is so critical to that.
I really agree, and I just appreciate that approach. And there's just such richness in this parable, not just the soil. But I am excited to then dive into, clearly Jesus is saying that the environment matters so much. And so, as we mentioned, there's plenty of good teaching out there and plenty of people that talk about habits and all of these wonderful things. But so often we can tend to think, well, what's the one thing I need to go do different? And I just think that often is missing arguably the most important part about growth, and that is creating an environment for growth. And as we jump into this, knowing how important an environment is for growth, I think you've helped me frame where I guess you could say more, but there's 3 really important aspects that you need to consider when you're building an environment that fosters growth. And so if you don't mind just giving an overview of what these 3 are.
Yeah, these 3 I think are really critical, because I think they are fundamental to anybody's growth in life. That is, we are so impacted by this one first environment, which there's a lot of good material about it, and that's the habits that we have. And we can dive into, and we will dive a little bit more into that environment, and not just building habits in general, but what habits really fit into good soil. The second environment that I think is critical is learning how to create self-growth. And by that, I mean in any venture in life, whether it's in work or in golf, if we're going to grow, we have to be able to self-coach. We need to be able to figure out, how do I move from point A to point B? Because there's not always someone sitting there telling us, do this, and then do this and do this. So we have to be able to evaluate what's going on and move ourselves. And so learning how to self-grow or self-coach is really important to it.
And even self-assess, like that first step of, yes, moving from A to B, but how often do we not even realize where A is?
Yes. So we'll be talking about
huge.
the habits that are habits of reflection that allow us to assess ourselves, which then allow us to figure out how do we move forward. And so that self-growth is so important and vital for anybody who wants to grow. Then the third one, I think, is one that is, I think, often underplayed so much, and that's the people of growth. That we are such an individualistic society, and we think that needing anybody else is a sign of weakness. And yet the Bible and wisdom would tell us that we desperately need one another, and we need some particular types of people in our life because we just don't have eyes to see. No matter how good we are at self-coaching, all of us have blind spots. And so we need those people in our life. And so it's this rhythm of habits and this rhythm of habits working with a consistent process of self-coaching, aided by people who can help us, that creates this really super trajectory that allows us to grow. And any one of these that are missing can really destroy the process of growth.
Right. And I love this because, like, growing anything, like there are these core elements that you need of what's in the soil, the water, everyone knows that, like, to create this environment for growth, you have certain elements that you need. And I just think that these three are so huge, and some of them get talked about a lot, some of them don't, but all of them are necessary.
Yeah, exactly. Even if you think about that parable of the sower and the fourth soil that we're trying to emulate, you have the soil, but you also need someone to water the soil.
Right.
And that needs to happen on a habitual basis. And so there's all of these elements that go into actually fruitfulness that are about more than just us and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, as I like to say, to become the perfect type of soil that doesn't need anybody, but is just going to bear lots of fruit. Lots of fruit is a lot bigger than just us. It involves us, and it involves great habits, and it involves our assessing it, but it also involves people, which from my faith perspective includes the Holy Spirit, includes God being really the waterer that makes the growth happen. So it all comes together.
At risk of exhausting this metaphor a little bit, the soil isn't just a self-contained thing, right? Like, it's the composite of the water that's going into it. That's not just for germinating the seed, right? Like, the soil actually changes because of the water. All of these things happen. And so I think that it's easy for us, for myself, to look at environment as just this soil. And it's like, well, I'm trying to grow, so I'm good, rich soil. Yeah. And they're just ingredients and elements that get missed.
Well, not to mention that you can have the richest topsoil in the world. If there are no seeds planted, nothing's going to grow.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly.
It really all comes together. You need seed, seed that is worth growing. You need the topsoil. You need the gardener and the water. It all kind of goes together. And that's what we're talking about. The tendency to just kind of pull on one of those pieces of environment and think that's adequate to bear, hundredfold fruitfulness is kind of just an illusion.
Yeah. So as we jump into this, how do we want to approach it? We've got habits, self-growth, and the people of growth as our three, I guess we can call them, elements of this environment. What's the best way to dive into this?
Well, let's start off. Let's just go in order of that, and then we're going to put some frames around all of this, just like we would if we were building a garden on this. So let's begin with habits, and I think that when we think of habits, we can again continue to beat up our soil analogy, because I think there are certain habits that are helpful. And one that anybody who listens to Space for Life or has read my book know I've just become so convinced of is the habit of spaciousness. And that's also because I've experienced so much of life without space. I almost feel like I went under as a human being from trying to live with no space in my life, no time, busyness, even doing really good things. And I found that that lack of space was choking the life out of me and my family. And I realized that God is a God who creates Sabbath, and God is a God who gives us 8 hours to sleep at night, and that we are meant to live with space in our life. And so we create habits of spaciousness. And there are a few habits of spaciousness that I'd say are almost fundamental, critical for us to live well. And one of them that I believe in some form or another, and I know this will step on toes or be a little bit uncomfortable, is the habit of space in the morning. That if we build lives that jump straight out of bed into breakneck speed and busyness, we're going to lead lesser lives. And so I am just a huge believer in creating space in the morning. And the habit of creating space, even if we do vastly different things, even if you do something different with your space than I do, just the habit of creating the space is something that good things can happen with. And so my encouragement would be build as much space in the morning as you can possibly afford. Now, your season of life may restrict that a lot. You might have kids who wake up and you can only afford 10 minutes space. I totally get that. You may be able to do a half an hour. I'm at a stage of life I can do a lot more than that. So our season of life has a lot to do with what we can do with this morning time spaciousness. But I would just encourage you to press the limits a little bit of that, because I find that the quantity and the quality of that morning time has so much to do with the quality of the rest of our day. And so I would really encourage people that if you did nothing else is to kind of just challenge that morning time, get up 10 or 15 minutes earlier, find some way to build that quiet, that spaciousness, that habit of spaciousness in your morning. So the second piece of that habit of spaciousness is building the margins around the events of our day. Because the more I can build those margins, the greater the quality of the events within the day, and the more I enjoy that day. And what I've found is that the more impactful the day becomes. So I used to think that my impact and my productivity was a function of the quantity that I could cram in the day. And what I've realized is that each day only has a few things that really move the needle. And if I can surround those few things, it might be a couple of meetings, it might be a podcast, it might be time for planning, but if I can surround those with that margin, that habit of spaciousness, then the quality and the depth and the amount of focus within those key events is so improved. So I can enter into a really busy day and do it fairly relaxed because I'm leaving myself that 5, 10, 15 minutes buffer on both sides of the key events. And so I can end up handling a lot. It's a phenomenal hack, if you want to say, for living well in a busy life. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. And what's cool about this habit in particular, one, all the reasons you just said. Two, in and of itself, as a habit, it leads to more growth. The other thing is exploring the interconnectedness of these. It is really hard to self-grow or self-assess or self-coach if you don't have any space. And it's really hard to feel like you have time for people when you have no margin throughout the day. Like the number of times where I feel like, oh, I would love to do this, or I would love to add a mentor or spend time even with the best friend, but I just feel like I'm at capacity.
Yeah.
And so this one habit affects everything, I think.
Well, exactly. I mean, you absolutely hit it right on the head. It's kind of the core, fundamental, foundational habit of all of the other good habits, because the reason that often people never reflect in their life is because they don't have time for it. You know, the reason people don't spend time with God is not because they don't think they should spend time with God, it's because they don't have time for it. You know, so
Right.
we get to this core habit of creating spaciousness. And then when you have this spaciousness, then the ability to reflect and to think, which then creates the opportunity and the potential for self-growth, just starts to explode all around, because all of a sudden you finish a breakfast or lunch with someone and you go out and you got 15 minutes and you got this time to go to just kind of mull and go, that was fascinating. Man, I really learned a lot, or I enjoyed that, or I wish I'd done this. And we'd start to think. And that very reflection process opens up the process of growth. And so these morning time, you know, compounded with the margin around our events, creates all of these possibilities that we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't do it nearly as well as I want to, but I can't oversell the impact that this has had both on the enjoyment that I have throughout my day, throughout my life, and the impact that I think I'm able to have when I'm leaning into this more. And so for almost every reason you can imagine, it's worth fighting for. And I use that word because it does feel like you have to fight for space.
Yeah. Well, it does, just like with every habit, until it becomes a habit. So let me just add a couple other things to it, because you have that morning time, and the other habit of spaciousness, which I believe so much in, is a weekly review, which is a time, a space that I create that is open, that I can linger in to think about the week that I just lived and that the week ahead of me, to think about what's important, what do I want to do, to reflect on who I am. And that weekly review time has become one of the most powerful habits that I've created in my life, probably within the last 10 years, I would say, that I've done that. Now, add one more layer to it. If we could create something along the lines of either monthly, quarterly, or at least annually spaces in our life to think broadly and deeply and reflectively about our lives. Now we've got a rhythm that works across all of the spheres of our life. We have a rhythm that lets us live well during the day, each day, individually. We have a rhythm that allows us to make the most out of each week. And then we have a rhythm that thinks even on a larger scale about how are we living over the long term of life. And I've found that those rhythms, which are all rhythms and come out of habits of spaciousness, is where growth really happens.
I would just say for these in particular, if you're looking for some type of actionable steps of how do I start implementing this. You've done a couple really good podcast episodes on, I know, like weekly rhythms and some other stuff on space that I'll link those. And I will say your book, Space to Breathe Again, is really, really helpful for these. And
Thanks.
so I just know that feeling of like, I want space. It sounds good. Where do I go from there? And you dive into that in a lot more detail than we'll be able to give in this episode. And so if that's interesting, that'll be linked in the description.
I think the weekly review one, which I'm such a believer in, is I think we titled it something like 30 minutes to your best week. So it kind of gets at how do we create our best week in just simply 30 minutes of time. But you'll see it's in kind of everything I talk about, the Sabbath, about, habits of a volunteer. It pervades everything because I've just seen it make such a difference in my life. Not as someone who this comes naturally by, as someone who it doesn't come naturally by, and as such realizes how deeply this habit impacts my life. So my hope is that it would have the same kind of impact on other people's lives.
You're right. It does kind of pervade a lot of your teaching and the things that we've talked about before. And so to me, there was always something that was kind of like going off in my head. I'm like, there's a reason that this is something that Tommy's talking about a lot. And just started paying more and more attention to it because of that. And it really is so impactful. And I don't think that could be oversold here.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that I would just maybe add before we move from this habits thing is just the core thing that knowing the right thing to do doesn't get you anywhere. It's doing the right thing. So when we talk about these habits, it's easy for potentially people who are listening to this to be nodding their heads, but that nodding of your heads doesn't accomplish anything without the doing of it. So we need to carry our analogy a little further, get down in the weeds, and we need to do this. So my encouragement would be to take that step with something that you may be fairly convinced is a good thing and put it into practice. Whether it's that morning time or that weekly review, focus heavily on making that happen, because that's when it's going to impact your life, not just believing it to be true.
Mm-hmm. And so habits, as important as they are, they're only one element of this environment that's necessary for growth. And so moving from habits, let's touch on the self-coaching or self-growth segment of it.
Yeah. So as we said, this habit, particularly this habit of spaciousness, is the foundation, because if we don't create that, we won't have time for people in our lives, particularly the important people I will be talking about, nor will we have the time or really the ability to think deeply about how do we grow, the self-coaching. It would be, I use golf analogies all the time. It would be like trying to become a good golfer without ever practicing. It just doesn't work. The game is too hard. Life is too hard. So the beauty is that if we create these places, these spaces in our lives, then all of a sudden we have the ability to step back and reflect. In fact, reflection becomes a little bit natural if you create these places. So I have my morning time space. And since I have the space, I'm going to do something with the space. So I pray during that space. I read the Bible during that space. And one of the things I do during that space, both Wheezy and I, and we have an episode on this, the art of journaling, but we journal. And that journal is where I take some specific time to reflect on what's going on around me, what happened during the day, and what's going on inside of me. And that self-reflection is a foundational, fundamental piece to self-coaching. Because if we're not reflecting, then we don't know what to change. If we're not reflecting, we have no individual ability to identify the blind spots in our life. So one of the, a blind spot is a blind spot. But the beauty is if we reflect enough, sometimes that reflection process, even on our own, can shine a light on something that is a blind spot. So I can reflect, for instance, on a Bible study that you and I went to that I taught this morning. And as I reflect on it, I begin to notice different things that happened in it. And that reflection allows me to grow and perhaps even identify some weak spots, some blind spots that I have as a teacher. And so that self-growth, that self-reflection allows for self-growth to happen. And so I notice, like even out on the range, as I'm reflecting, as I'm paying attention to what I'm feeling, I actually learn and I can teach myself on the range. And so that same thing happens in the weekly review. It happens in the morning time. It happens in little retreats that we might happen where we create the space. And what happens? Well, we got to do something with it. We reflect. And as we reflect,
Right.
we think and we pay attention to things and we become self-aware. And that self-awareness is fundamental. So instead of thinking we've got to just grit our teeth and we just got to think really hard in order to grow, we just create the space and we allow that self-growth and that self-awareness to happen simply by thinking about what happened the day before and understanding it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one thing, though, that I would like to say to that is this idea of space or reflection, if I'm being honest, feels uncomfortable for me to work towards. But to actually lean into growth, there is that uncomfortable element of I'm going to slow down here. And then it is that the way that you said it sounds kind of effortless, and in some ways it is, but to get yourself in that position does take some effort.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have to grow into it becoming effortless. So, one of my favorite books, Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline, he talks about the habits or the disciplines of silence and solitude. And I know so many people who just, shiver at the thought of just being silent for a period of time or being alone for a period of time. They will orient the entirety of their lives to avoid that. And so you're so right that particularly in the early stages, even a morning time or a weekly review is bound to feel uncomfortable. And it would be easy to give up after one or two times of trying it and going, this doesn't work. But I think as you're saying, and I'm so glad you said it, we need to lean into and persevere through that uncomfortableness. And on the other side of it, there's such benefits to that. So thank you for adding that. That's really powerful.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about it in terms of golf too, as you were just saying. Like, it's easy for me to get on the range and try to hit 200, 300 golf balls because I'm like, I'm putting in the work, right? I'm just raking balls, going one after another, versus what actually is difficult is taking a little bit of time and working on my alignment in between shots and only hitting 50 to 90 shots maybe and putting in that space in between the shots. But then my brain's telling me, it's like, well, you're not working as hard at it, but it actually is work in some ways. And so it's just, I think for at least my personality, it's worth acknowledging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you are not alone on that. Every one of us enters that. And even as you begin to grow, there are always new uncomfortable places to enter into. So there are some uncomfortable places that that I am thinking about in my own life, and I won't spill those all out on everybody, but they are uncomfortable for me, and I'm having to say, yeah, that uncomfortableness is good. This is a place I need to grow. So that uncomfortableness is probably a great sign right on the front end that you're headed in the right direction.
Right. Nicole Eunice, who's been on this podcast, I was recording one with her the other week, and she was talking about how we tend to think there's this inner circle that's like the comfort zone, and then immediately outside of that barrier is pain. And it's just a quick divide. But really, there's a concentric circle in between the two. And in that space, that's the growth zone, where it's outside of comfort, but before you get to pain. And I think that it can often be what we use as a diagnostic that something's wrong, when often that's a good place to enter into.
Yeah, and if we go back to the parable of the sowers, an unwillingness to enter into that is simply a choice to be shallow. And ironically, that choice to be shallow is the very choice that when things get hard will burn us out. So it's not like we can just choose to be in the comfort zone. The more we choose to try to exist just in the comfort zone, the smaller and narrower that comfort zone becomes. And then we finally get to a place that we can't. We just are suffering because we are trying to live only in a comfort zone. So it doesn't work even if you are just trying to avoid the uncomfortableness.
Right. Whereas living just outside of it is so expansive, and it really is so freeing too.
Yes.
So there's a lot we could go there, but for the sake of time on this episode, I won't digress anymore. What else though, as we're thinking about the self-growth aspect of creating an environment, what would you say about that?
Yeah. I think one of the most important human skills that we can develop is the skill of listening. And I would say within that skill of listening, the most important skill of listening is listening to ourselves. And when I say listening to ourselves, I mean, from my faith perspective, listening to God, who I believe lives within me, in such a way that when I'm listening to myself, I'm listening to Him speaking to me. So I know that's a little vague and abstract, but the more I work to listen to myself, actually the less I need to worry about, well, is that God speaking or is that me speaking? You know, I learned to begin to discern those negative voices that happen within me that are not the voices that I should listen to. And I learned to listen to those life-giving voices, which I believe are the Holy Spirit working and changing me. So we want to learn to listen, and that's listening to what's going on within us, and listening, which is watching also the things going on around us, because there's so many clues to life going on around us. So if we pay attention in this process of self-growth, life is giving us so many clues about what's not working and what is working. We can see that in our relationship with our spouse. If we will just pay attention, what's not working and what is working. And if we can begin to pay that attention, then we can quickly course correct and start to do more of the things that's working with our spouse and less of the things that aren't. So it goes across all of the different spheres, that if we just learn to be people that are paying attention. And this integrates very well with one of the most popular things in psychology and self-improvement these days, which is mindfulness. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And to that degree, there's so much valuable as we are mindful about what's going on within us and around us. And even if you're one that a little bit is uncomfortable with that term, there is so much of value in learning to pay attention and to listen and be attentive and to watch what's going on around us. I think it's fundamental to self-growth.
I do too. And just to bring it back real quick to the spaciousness piece, the example of driving somewhere, it came to mind of the number of times that I'll drive a route that's daily or close to it. And I'll do it again at another time when I'm not in a hurry. And I'll notice 10 different things that I missed every single time that I was driving it before. And there's just, without like that space, it's just, I would say impossible, or if not very nearly impossible, to notice some of those signs.
Yeah, well, let me add to that. I have in the book Space to Breathe Again a chapter called The Hidden Sanctuary, and the hidden sanctuary is our car. So you add what you're talking about, and then you add into what happens if you choose to drive with no noise. Mm-hmm. And you've got, for some people, an hour or two of built-in space in every day just in your time in the car. And not that we need to spend every moment of that in silence, but isn't it worth spending some of it? Wouldn't it just help us enter into wherever we're going in a better frame of mind? So, our car can be a great place to create some of this spaciousness that we so need.
Whereas so often I'm trying to shave 30 seconds, 45 seconds off a trip, and that's like driving me, and it's, that's a whole nother story. But like, what if I would embrace the space that's provided there instead of trying to just get there faster and move on to the next thing sooner?
And what would happen if we, instead of trying to cram in another podcast, even Space for Life, if we just had some space in that? So it all goes together. And when you begin to get a taste of it, you start to see all of the different places that this can be transformative of your life.
I love that. So then the last, and to me, just one of the most valuable pieces of creating the environment is the people that we surround ourselves with.
Yeah. So there are lots of different things that I can say, and we could go way, way too long in this, but I want to say a few things. First of all, that core habit of spaciousness is what we need in order to have space for the people we care about the most. Forget what those people may or may not be able to do for us. It's the people we love that we want to have time for, that we often sacrifice at the altar of busyness, that is the victim of our spacelessness. And so I want to say that one of the greatest and most important beneficiaries of the habit of spaciousness is the people we love. And that's where life is found. Now, in addition to that, and we almost don't need to go in addition to that, but there is so much in addition to that. There are particular people that if we invite them into our life can help us grow. Because no matter how much we try to do it on our own, we were designed to not be able to do it on our own. So that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, where everything was good, where everything was perfect, God said, it is not good that man is alone. We were never meant to do life on our own. Even if we could get away with not caring about other people, we couldn't become the people we were meant to be on our own. And so what I want to do just real briefly is identify 4 people that I think all of us could benefit from having in our life. And we have kind of words that we can use for them, but also can put kind of names to them from the Bible for people who would like to do this. So the first one I would say is we need mentors in our life. That is people who have gone before us, people who have walked the road, who are further advanced than us in the places we want to go. We need business mentors. We need personal mentors. We need spiritual mentors. We need all sorts of mentors. Deciding how many and in what areas is a personal decision. But in the Bible, Paul, the Apostle Paul, was a mentor, a spiritual guide, father, he calls it, to Timothy. And Timothy looked and learned from Paul. And there are other mentors in the Bible, but I think having a mentor is just a way of supercharging our growth. Instead of only learning by our own failures, we can actually learn from other people's failures. And I love to mentor people. And the way I mentor people is to tell them all the places I failed, all the places I fell on my face. And I'm hoping that helps them so that they don't have to fall on their face in order to learn the same lesson. So it's the failures that a good mentor will offer to their mentees. You know, the places that they fall in. Of course, some things they've learned well along the way too. So that would be that first person, a Paul, a mentor in your life. Want me to keep on going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please do.
The second one that I think is vastly underappreciated is a mentee, that is someone that you pour yourself into. There is something powerful that happens when you pour yourself into someone else's life. They say that one of the best ways of learning a subject is to teach it. And that's the same thing in life, that we actually learn and grow when we teach others, when we mentor others. And I've seen that just happen constantly because I love to mentor. And I find that as I do that, and it takes some courage to do that, to risk feeling presumptuous in mentoring someone. But as you do that, I find I'm the one that benefits the most. So for 3 years, I helped lead a mentoring ministry at our church, Hope Church. I heard consistently, year after year during those 3 years, the most consistent message was the mentors coming back to me and say, I grew more than I've ever grown by doing this. So, but most people think they have no right. And so they miss out on a great learning opportunity by pouring themselves into someone else. Okay, the example of that is Timothy. And Paul tells Timothy to learn to fan the flame that is within him, but to then pass that down to others. So it's really scriptural to mentor other people. All right, so the third type is what I would call a soul friend. And that's someone that probably you get things from. That person may mentor you in some fashion. You may mentor them, but it's someone that you sink in on a deep, deep level. And if you can find a soul friend in life, it is one of the greatest gifts that God will ever have you. And you may have many friends that kind of form a composite soul friend, that this friend is really my soul friend in this area of life, and this friend is my soul friend when it comes to this area of my life. And that's all fine. The soul friend that is talked about in the Bible, I think there are many, but is Jonathan. Jonathan was a soul friend to David, and he was that friend that David would give his life for, and Jonathan would give his life for David. And when you get to that friend, some people call it the 2 a.m. friend, the friend that you would call at 2 a.m. in the morning because you need someone that will just be there, that you can pour out the deepest parts of your soul to. That scares the daylights out of almost everybody, as it has me. I've had to grow into some of my soul friendships, but it is some of the most blessed, rich places of life is those soul friends that you have. So one last person that I'll throw out. Any thoughts before I go on?
I love these. And you said it earlier, but what's so great about the people of growth is it's a massive element if we want to grow, which I think anyone listening to this podcast does, but it's just also where the richness of life is with these relationships. And so it's kind of like you can't lose in this. Like it's where the best things about life, and it leads to the most growth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the stuff that is talked about at the funerals, right? At the memorial services, is those friends and who we were to other people. That's what's talked about. So
and I don't think I've ever heard anyone on their deathbed say they regretted pouring too much into relationships.
Yeah, no. So this is core. It takes a reframing though about what is really important and what is valuable and what we want to live for. And that's been one of the really most beautiful parts for me about this season of life for me is I've been able to reframe so much of living into what I really care about the most. Whereas in the earlier seasons of life, partly by necessity, I lived almost in a sense for other people's priorities and what other people said was valuable. So, as much as life will allow, I think living for these places, for these people, for this impact is what will bring great joy and meaning to life. So the last person that I've really just recently given some thought to is, who is the prophet in your life? Who is the prophet in your life? And in the Bible, a prophet was not as much someone who told the future, which is what we typically think of a prophet as a prophet was a person who was willing to speak hard truth. And so you think about Isaiah and Jeremiah and Elijah, some of the big prophets, and it even talks about Moses and people like that as a prophet. They were people who spoke the hard truth that other people needed to hear, usually the people of Israel, but sometimes individual people. And one of the great examples of a prophet is the prophet Nathan. And so back in the time of King David, he messed up big time. He went, and as king, he took advantage of his situation and of his status, and he had an awful affair with Bathsheba. And then he covered up that affair by sending Bathsheba's husband into warfare, assuring that he would be killed so he could have Bathsheba as wife. It was one of the worst abuses of power that could ever happen. So who was going to confront David with his evil that he did? Well, the prophet Nathan had the courage to speak, and he came before David, and by way of parable, he ended up saying to David, "You're the man. You're the man that has done this evil." And David, by the grace of God, repented and realized, and he came back to God and he wept before God. He said, "I'm so sorry." And Nathan was responsible for turning David's life around. So the question I thought about as this was presented really beautifully in Gary Thomas's book, a recent guest on Space for Life, in his book, The Life You Were Reborn to Live, is who is the Nathan in your life? Who is the person that you have given overt permission to speak hard things to, that you're willing to go to and say, "Tell me what I need to know. Tell me the real truth, not the truth I want to hear, not the polite truth, not the flattering truth, but tell me the thing that you see that I really need to hear." And that takes a real friend to do that. But how powerful if someone like you, Joe, at your age, gave someone the permission to tell the really hard things to. How powerful that would be if you gave that prophet that permission to speak into your life. How would that change your growth trajectory? And so that is a powerful, unspoken person that can create a growth path in our life.
Because I think at some point we all have to ask, like, do we really want to grow? And if we do, we've already established that it requires a willingness to enter into some level of uncomfort or discomfort. And so you have to assume then that there are these things. And if no one has that permission, I mean, are we really setting ourselves up at all for a place of growth?
I can tell you in our day and culture, people won't do it unless you give them permission.
Right.
It's too risky. You know, you bite your head off, you'd be unappreciated, you'll break off the relationship. So if we don't give people permission, it really won't happen. So all of these things, and we've covered just so much territory, you know, in this. But I guess maybe to summarize, in a sense, we have this core habit of spaciousness. That is a foundation that so much happens. And out of that spaciousness, we create the possibility to reflect and to listen and to become self-aware. And then we have the ability to supercharge that by adding these people that can speak into our life and that we can speak into. And it's these things that I think create not just tiny, incremental, hardly noticeable growth in our lives, but allow us to grow by leaps and bounds, where we could say a year down the road or a few years, I am a different person for good than I was. And that is what excites me. That's what I desire to keep going in my life, even at my age. And I hope to actually keep going until my dying breath. It's the best of life, as we've talked about.